My name is Elena, a 23-year-old college senior with sights set firmly on becoming a journalist. But today, instead of celebrating my pending graduation, I'm trapped in a nightmare that's all too real. Barely 24 hours have passed since we buried my dad, Martin. He was the kind of father who managed to make me feel loved despite always being halfway across the world on business. The house feels emptier without him, a silent testament to the void his passing has left. As I stand in the foyer, still numb from the funeral, my mother Claudia and sister Victoria waste no time in announcing their plans. Their words ring in my ears like the tolling of a bell, a funeral knell for any lingering sense of family unity. "We're going to sell this house," Claudia says, the cold glint in her eye betraying her feigned solemnity. "Start looking for a new place, Elena. You better be out soon." I can hardly believe what I'm hearing. Before I can process the loss of my dad, they're already thinking about money and what they can gain from his death. It feels like a betrayal too large to comprehend. "You don't think you're entitled to anything, do you?" Victoria taunts, her boyfriend John chuckling beside her. Their cruel amusement makes my blood boil. I shouldn't be hearing these words, not at this moment when the pain is so raw. I never understood their greed, their obsession with wealth and appearances. I was the family outcast, too serious, too studious. Elena the dreamer, they'd mock. And now, faced with their scheming, all the years of indifference and mockery come to a head. "You're the worst," I cry out, unable to rein in my anger. "I'm done with this. I'm done with all of you." The bell rings, punctuating my outburst. Irritated at the interruption, I wipe away angry tears and swing the door open. A man in a dark suit stands before me, a briefcase in hand, his face striking a chord of vague recognition. "My condolences," he says solemnly. "May I come in?" Who is this stranger with a tone so grave, appearing at the most unexpected time? I'm not ready to deal with anyone else, not now. But something in his gaze tells me this isn't a mere courtesy visit. I step aside and let him enter, wondering what this could possibly mean for the fragile remnants of our broken family. The echo of my father's laughter once filled the hallways of our home, a balm to the sting of my mother and sister's sharper tones. Now those walls seem to press in on me, the memories of their hurtful words blending with the emptiness his absence has wrought. I'd always sought solace in my studies, believing that someday those books would lead me to a life of purpose, free from the shallow desires that drove Claudia and Victoria. But as I sit at the dining table, it's hard to focus on anything but the void Martin's passing left behind. Silent meals had become a new norm since Dad got sick and then passed away. Victoria would be on her phone, and Claudia would flip through high-fashion magazines, their detachment from our reality stark and unyielding. Their latest plan to dispose of our home and leave me behind hammered the final nail in the coffin of our family bonds. They seemed so eager to chase their fantasies of luxury condos and designer lives that nothing else mattered. Dad had been our anchor, and I'd expected at least a pretense of unity after he was gone. But now, faced with their naked opportunism, the lie of family was exposed, and something inside me snapped. Tired of being the outsider, the one who cared, I was ready to walk away from it all. Adrift in these thoughts, the doorbell rings, a sound I now associate with disruption and unwelcome news. At the door stands a man from my father's past, someone whose connections to our family had faded over time. "Good evening," he greets me. "I need to speak with you about your father's affairs." His solemn tone carries a formality that seems out of place in our disheveled living room, now a stark reminder of our discordant family. I nod, gesturing for him to sit down. Claudia and Victoria peek from the kitchen, their curious faces pinched with irritation. The man pulls out a stack of papers from his briefcase, his expression grim. "I'm Mr. Adams, your father's attorney. He entrusted me with his will and some final instructions," he explains as he adjusts his glasses, preparing to deliver news that feels poised to shake the foundations of our already crumbling household. Claudia leans in, her interest piqued. Victoria tries to look uninterested, yet hovers close by. As Mr. Adams begins to speak, I brace myself for what's to come, unsure of the consequences, but certain that our family dynamics are about to change once again. The room seems to contract with tension as Mr. Adams clears his throat, unfolding the document that held the final wishes of Martin, my father. Claudia and Victoria perched on the edge of their seats, their eyes betraying a keenness they'd struggled to mask since we lost him. In accordance with your father's requests, Mr. Adams starts, I am here to read the will and begin the process of executing his instructions. He looks around at each of us, perhaps gauging our readiness for what he's about to divulge. I can't help but feel a sense of dread. Growing up in the shadow of my mother and sister's expectations had taught me to expect little, to brace for disappointment. Yet, as the attorney's words begin to flow, it's evident that our expectations are about to be overturned. To my daughter Elena, I leave the entirety of my estate, including the family home and all accumulated savings and investments. The room falls silent, but for the rustling of paper and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. Mr. Adams continues to read, but I barely register his words. All I can hear is the thundering beat of my heart and a kind of ringing in my ears. It can't be right. There must be some mistake. Me? I finally managed to stammer, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. But why? Victoria's chair scrapes violently against the floor as she stands, her eyes widening in a mix of shock and fury. Claudia, similarly stunned, remains seated, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. John, who had until now hovered quietly in the background, steps forward as if to protect or perhaps restrain Victoria. This is some kind of joke, right? He demands, but Mr. Adams simply offers a somber shake of his head. There's no error, he assures us. Martin was very specific in his directive. He believed that Elena, with her convictions and work ethic, would best honor his legacy and manage his assets responsibly. Claudia finds her voice as disbelief gives way to anger. But what of us? She snaps. Her mother and sister? Are we to be left with nothing while she takes everything? The question hangs in the air, a palpable cloud of resentment radiating from my mother and sister. I'm at a loss for words, torn between the immense responsibility thrust upon me and the sting of their evident greed. Mr. Adams meets my gaze. Martin had his reasons, which he believed would be understood in time. For now, we must discuss the next steps and the details of the estate. As he talks, I can't help but wonder what my father saw in me, what faith he had placed in my hands, and how I could ever hope to fulfill it amidst the ruins of our family unity. The silence after Mr. Adams's revelation feels almost as heavy as the sadness that gripped me during my father's funeral. Claudia and Victoria's outrage fills the room, crashing against my shock like waves against a cliff. For a moment, no one speaks. We're trapped in a standstill, the implications of my father's will cutting through the air like a cold wind. My reasons, Mr. Adams finally continues, looking directly at me, were detailed in a personal letter left to me by your father for you, Elena. I'm to give it to you after the reading of the will. Victoria's voice breaks the spell, but there must be some mistake. I mean, she can't just get everything. Her words ricochet off the walls, heralding a battle I have no desire to fight. John puts a restraining hand on her shoulder, but it does nothing to dampen her spirit. And what about us? What are we, strangers, he decided to discard after everything we've done for him? She seizes upon the words like a weapon, her voice rising to a crescendo of disbelief. Claudia's mask of shock peels away, revealing the anger beneath. Exactly, there must be some provision for this, some oversight or option for dispute. This is preposterous. Her hands grip the arms of her chair, knuckles whitening. I finally find my voice, feeble though it sounds even to my ears. I don't understand. Why would Dad do this? What was he thinking? My mind races with unanswered questions, all pointing to a man I realized I may never have truly known. Mr. Ray. Adams removes his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose before responding. Martin had his reasons, and he wanted you to know them. But in his own words. As for Claudia and Victoria, he turns to address them, you may contest the will if you wish, though Martin's instructions were explicit, and his sound mind, when drafting it, is well documented. The room falls into chaos once more. Voices clash as Claudia and Victoria express their anger and confusion, scrambling for a plan of action. I barely hear them. My thoughts are with the unopened letter, a final message from my father that burns a hole in the table where it lies. Taking a deep breath, I reach for the letter. The paper feels both insubstantial and as heavy as lead in my hands. Unfolding the creases, I prepare to read the words of a man who chose to speak from beyond the grave rather than in life, a man who has now left me an inheritance that feels more like a chalice of poison than a cup of blessings. Alone in my room, with the door securely closed, I unfolded the letter with trembling hands. Each crease seemed to hold a whisper of my father's voice, and as the written words appeared, I braced myself for the understanding that was about to come. Dearest Elena, it began in my father's familiar script. As you read this, I am sorry that I am not there to tell you these things in person. Sorry that I am leaving you with a burden that a parent should never bestow on their child. His apology, sincere and immediate, cut through the complexities of legal jargon and blunt revelations that had filled the air just moments ago. I inhaled deeply, the scent of ink on paper somewhat comforting. Your strength, your discipline, and your vision for a better world have never been invisible to me. In you, I saw the promise of a future that embraced honesty and integrity, far from the grasping hands of greed. The letter trembled in my hands, not from a breeze through the old window pane, but from the wellspring of emotions it unleashed. My eyes continued down the page. Elena, I've not been blind to the ways of our household. Your patience and hard work in the face of neglect by your mother and sister have been both my heartache and my pride. Giving you the entirety of my estate is my way of reconciling with the unfair responsibilities you've been forced to shoulder. Each sentence wove a tapestry of my father's unspoken observations and quiet support. The man who seemed a distant provider had been watching all along, understanding more than he let on. My only hope is that this inheritance will provide the freedom and the means for you to fulfill those aspirations that burn so brightly within you. Do not feel confined to fix what was broken long before you could make a difference. Live the life you deserve, my Elena. I folded the letter, pressing it against my chest, feeling the ink-etched love of a father who had seen his daughter's unassuming sacrifices. A wave of determination swept through me, mixed with the grief that had trailed me like a shadow since his passing. Leaving the safety of my room, I stepped back into the storm that was my fractured family. Mr. Adams glanced up as I entered, a silent question in his gaze. Claudia's glare was sharp, fixated on me, and Victoria was pacing like a caged animal, her earlier rage turned desperate. It's time to talk about what happens next, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Claudia scoffed. What happens next is that we challenge this farce. Victoria nodded vehemently. You won't get away with this, Elena. We deserve our share. Mr. Adams interjected. Any legal challenge will be a lengthy and costly process with no guaranteed outcome. Martin's will is clear and well within his rights to enforce. With my father's words burning a hole in my pocket, I faced them, the family that had never truly been a family. It wasn't my decision, but it was his, and I intend to honor it. Tension wrapped chains around us all, but amid the chaos, one truth held steadfast. I would carry out my duty, uphold my father's wishes, and through them, perhaps find my own path to a better world. In the following days, the house became a war zone of oppressively silent mornings and thunderous arguments. Victoria and Claudia scoured legal forums and consulted with lawyers, desperately seeking a loophole to contest the will. They clung to the belief that they were entitled to Martin's legacy, viewing it as their rightful due rather than the gift of a man's life work. Despite their efforts, Mr. Adams remained unflappable, a steady pillar amid the tempest. His calm demeanor was a source of comfort as we navigated the uncharted waters of estate settlement. The will is airtight, Elena, he assured me once again over cups of tepid coffee in the formal dining room. You need not worry about their threats. Yet even with his reassurances, guilt gnawed at me. Was it right to accept everything while my mother and sister got nothing? The logical part of my brain reminded me that my father had his reasons, but my heart couldn't shake the residual familial obligation, a desire to mend what was broken, even when I knew it was beyond repair. I spent my days preparing for the inevitable legal challenges and familiarizing myself with Martin's finances. The responsibility was daunting, running the numbers, making decisions about property and investments I never knew existed. Each step felt like wading through fog, but I was determined to see it through, to build on the small beacon of trust my father had left me. It was during these sessions of poring over financial statements that my mind would wander to the life awaiting beyond these walls, how to use this inheritance to forge a path aligned with my own values, how I could make a lasting impact. Amid the chaos, Claudia and Victoria grew increasingly agitated, their true colors seeping out in bursts of pettiness and spite. In an impulsive display, Victoria claimed sentimental family heirlooms, while Claudia hinted at dark secrets that could tarnish Martin's name. Their insinuations aimed to wound, to shake my resolve, but I had become adept at navigating their emotional minefields. One particularly tense evening, the air thick with unsaid threats and frigid stares, I reached my breaking point. "Enough," I said, the single word slicing through the tension. 3 pairs of eyes fixed on me, uncertain, wary. "I can't give you what Dad didn't leave for you, but what I can do is help you start over somewhere else." Their shock was palpable, an abrupt shift in the dynamic they had been fueling. "It won't be a life of luxury, but it will be a fresh start." Claudia's laughter was sharp, humorless. "A concession prize from our dearest Elena. How magnanimous." Her sarcasm was a familiar sting, but it glanced off the armor years of antagonism had helped me forge. I stood firm, despite the bitterness that clawed at the air between us. "It's not a prize. It's a choice. Take it or leave it. But understand this. I am moving forward, with or without your acceptance." Their response was a symphony of silence and begrudging nods, a tenuous agreement forged at the crossroads of greed and survival. As I retreated to my room, the letter's weight in my pocket reminded me of the journey ahead, one where I'd navigate not only the inheritance, but also who I would become as a consequence of it. The days turned into weeks as my life became a routine of meetings with Mr. Adams and navigating the complex process of realizing my inheritance. Claudia and Victoria, having reluctantly accepted my offer, began their search for a more modest place to call home. The atmosphere grew less contentious, though the air still held a chill that went beyond the coming of winter. It was a time of paradoxical solitude amidst the chaos. The house felt larger and more desolate with each packed box and removed piece of furniture. I found temporary solace in my father's study, which remained untouched, a capsule of the past that echoed with a time when family strife was just a faint undercurrent beneath the surface of our daily lives. The day finally came when Claudia and Victoria left the house for the last time. With the sign of a check and a curt farewell, they were gone, taking with them remnants of a life that was forever changed. Standing in the doorway, I watched as their car disappeared around the bend, feeling an unsettling mixture of relief and sorrow. It was time to look to the future. With Mr. Adams' help, I set up a charitable foundation in my father's name, dedicated to fostering educational opportunities for young underprivileged students. Students like the younger version of myself, who once believed her dreams were unattainable within the confines of a home that didn't understand her aspirations. I enrolled in graduate school, pursuing a program in journalism that would put me on the path to the career I'd always envisioned. As I worked towards my master's degree, I used the network my father had left behind, along with the resources now at my disposal, to intern at a prominent newspaper. My life was busier than I ever imagined, filled with the pursuit of stories and justice, just like I discussed with my father on those long-distance calls that now felt like a lifetime ago. These days, I'm always on the go, carrying with me the principles that he instilled in me. The house, once a cage of sorts, began to feel more like a home as I made it my own. I repainted walls, rearranged furniture, and even adopted a rescue dog, a joyful presence that filled the emptiness with barks and boundless energy. The rooms that had once witnessed family feuds now opened up to friends, colleagues, and laughter. Sometimes I'd find myself in my father's study, poring over his old letters and the faded pages of his books. My eyes would linger on the signature at the bottom of his letter, the final message that had altered the course of my life. "Duty and love," he wrote, "are the strongest forces we wield. Use them well." And in those quiet moments, surrounded by the legacy of words and wisdom that my father left behind, I'd whisper a promise to do just that.
This story is titled, "My Daughter Said I Wasn't Supportive and Banned Me from Her Wedding. So I froze my cards, and now she's in debt." Hey everyone! If you're enjoying these stories and want to support the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps me bring you even more awesome content like this. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, I never thought I'd be in this position. I worked so hard to give my daughter, Claire, the life she deserved after everything fell apart when her mom and I divorced. She was 12 when Stephanie and I split up, and even though it wasn't an ugly divorce, it was still hard on Claire. Stephanie remarried within a year and had 3 more kids in quick succession, first a baby girl and then twin boys. While Stephanie moved on to a new chapter of her life, Claire was left feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. At first, I didn't see it for what it was. I thought maybe Claire just needed time to adjust to the changes. But as time went on, it became clear that she felt pushed aside, like she'd been replaced in her mother's life. To make things worse, Stephanie wasn't exactly subtle about her priorities. Most of her attention went to the new kids, and Claire was often left to fend for herself emotionally. I knew I had to step up. I made it my mission to be Claire's rock. I took on extra hours at work to make sure I could give her what she needed. I showed up to every game, every parent-teacher meeting, and every little milestone. I was determined to be the constant in her life, the one person she could always rely on. I thought I was doing everything right, but looking back now, I wonder if I overdid it. Maybe I protected her too much, gave her too much, and never let her learn how to stand on her own 2 feet. Things started to unravel when Claire decided to take a 2-year break from high school. She said she needed time to figure herself out. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I wanted to support her. Not every kid follows the same timeline, right? Some kids take longer to find their path, and that's okay. Or at least that's what I told myself. But what started as a break to find herself quickly turned into a free pass to do nothing. Instead of focusing on her sports or exploring new interests, Claire spent her days watching TV, scrolling through her phone, and hanging out with friends I didn't trust. These weren't the type of friends who'd encourage her to grow or push her to do better. They were aimless, just like she was becoming. I tried talking to her about it, but every conversation ended in an argument. If I so much as hinted that she needed to get her act together, she'd explode, accusing me of not understanding her or not supporting her. It felt like I was walking on eggshells every day, trying to balance being supportive while also trying to steer her in the right direction. The breaking point came one night when she tried to sneak out after I'd gone to bed. I caught her climbing out her bedroom window, and when I confronted her, she screamed at me like I was the villain in her story. She didn't see that I was trying to protect her. She only saw me as the obstacle in her way. That night, I sat down and really thought about where I'd gone wrong. Had I been too lenient? Had I given her too much freedom? Or was it something else entirely? Something I couldn't control, like the impact of the divorce or her feeling abandoned by her mom? Desperate to help her, I turned to therapy. Claire started seeing a therapist, and for a while I thought it was helping. She seemed calmer, more willing to talk about her feelings. But then she'd quit therapy as soon as it started getting uncomfortable. This cycle went on for years. Therapy, quitting, acting out, and then therapy again. I tried everything else I could think of too. Late night talks, family trips, even bribes. I bought her the latest gadgets, thinking they might motivate her to focus on school or sports. I took her on vacations, hoping a change of scenery might reset her mindset. Nothing worked. Finally, after 2 long years, Claire agreed to go back to school. I was relieved. No, I was overjoyed. I thought we'd finally turned a corner. I thought she was ready to take her life seriously and start building a future for herself. For a brief moment, I felt like all the stress and heartache of the past 2 years had been worth it. But that relief didn't last long. Not even 6 months after returning to school, Claire met Jake. Jake was 26, a delivery guy for his parents' bakery. He'd dropped out of high school in the 9th grade and had been coasting through life ever since. His idea of ambition was seeing where the road takes me. At first, I didn't want to judge him too harshly. Honest work is honest work, and not everyone's cut out for college. But as their relationship got more serious, I started to see the cracks in his facade. Jake wasn't just aimless, he was reckless. He'd been married once before when he was 21. That marriage lasted 6 months before he and his wife split up because it just wasn't working. It didn't take a genius to see that this guy wasn't ready for a serious commitment, let alone marriage. Claire, of course, saw none of this. To her, Jake was perfect. He was charming and funny, and he made her feel special in a way she hadn't felt in years. I wanted to be happy for her. I wanted to trust her judgment, but everything about their relationship set off alarm bells in my head. Then, out of nowhere, Claire announced they were getting married. It wasn't a discussion. It wasn't a request for advice. It was a statement of fact. She'd already set the date and started planning the wedding, all without telling me. When I tried to talk to her about it, she shut me down. "You're just jealous because I'm happy," she said. I didn't know what to say. How do you argue with someone who's blinded by love? How do you convince your child that they're making a mistake when they're convinced they know better? That night, I sat in the living room alone, staring at the walls, wondering where I'd gone wrong. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made for Claire, all the times I'd put her needs above my own, and all the ways I'd tried to be the best father I could be. And now, here I was, watching her run headfirst into disaster, unable to stop her. It was the first time I realized that no matter how much you love your child, you can't protect them from their own choices. The day Claire announced she was getting married felt like a punch to the gut. She didn't sit me down or ask for advice. She just dropped the news casually over dinner, as if she was talking about what movie she wanted to watch. Jake and I are getting married next month, she said, smiling like she just shared the best news in the world. For a second, I thought she was joking. What do you mean married? I asked, hoping I'd misheard her. We're in love, she said, shrugging like it was no big deal. We've already picked a date and everything. I was stunned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My 19-year-old daughter, who still hadn't finished high school and had no job, was planning to marry a guy she'd only been dating for a few months. A guy who had no ambition, no stability, and no plan for his future. Claire, don't you think this is a little rushed? I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Marriage is a big decision. Have you thought this through? She rolled her eyes. Dad, you always overthink everything. Jake and I are soulmates. We don't need your approval. That hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd always been the parent she could rely on, the one who supported her through everything. And now she was telling me my opinion didn't matter. I tried to reason with her. Claire, you're still so young. You've got your whole life ahead of you. Why not take some time to focus on school and your future first? Marriage can wait. Her expression turned cold. You're just being negative. I knew you wouldn't support me. That's when I realized how serious she was. This wasn't a phase or a rebellion. She was genuinely convinced that this was the right decision. And no matter what I said, she wasn't going to listen. Over the next few days, I tried to talk to her about it again, but every conversation ended in an argument. I brought up practical concerns, like how they were going to support themselves. Do you have a plan for finances? Where are you going to live? How are you going to pay rent or utilities? She brushed it off like none of it mattered. We'll figure it out, she said. Love is all we need. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Claire, love is important, but it doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't put food on the table. Marriage isn't just about romance. It's about responsibility. She rolled her eyes again. You're stuck in the past, Dad. Things are different now. You don't understand. I wanted to scream. How could she not see what a mistake this was? How could she be so blind to the reality of what she was getting herself into? Things came to a head when I asked to meet Jake. I figured if I couldn't get through to Claire, maybe I could talk some sense into him. We arranged to meet at a local diner, and I tried to keep an open mind. Jake seemed nice enough on the surface, polite, friendly, even a little charming. But as we talked, it became clear that he had no idea what he was getting into. What's your plan for the future? I asked him, trying to keep my tone neutral. He shrugged. We'll figure it out as we go. I clenched my jaw to keep from losing my temper. Marriage isn't something you can just figure out. It takes planning and preparation. Do you have any savings? A budget? A long-term goal? He just nodded along, like he was listening, but I could tell he wasn't really paying attention. I tried a different approach. Claire's still in school and she doesn't have a job. Are you prepared to support her financially until she gets on her feet? His answer? We'll manage. Love is more important than money. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to work. Jake wasn't a bad guy, but he was completely unprepared for the reality of marriage. And Claire, who was already struggling to find her footing, was diving headfirst into a situation that would only make things harder for her. When I got home that night, I sat Claire down and tried to talk to her again. I told her about my concerns and asked her to reconsider. Claire, I'm not trying to control your life, I said. I just want what's best for you. Can't you see that this isn't the right time for you to get married? You have so much potential, so many opportunities ahead of you. Why rush into something like this? Her response was ice cold. If you can't support me, then I don't want you at my wedding. Those words hit me like a knife to the chest. Claire, you don't mean that, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I do, she said firmly. You're not invited if you're just going to be negative. I don't want your bad energy ruining my big day. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own daughter was banning me from her wedding because I didn't agree with her decision. That night, I made a decision. If she didn't want me at her wedding, I wasn't going to pay for it. Claire had been planning the whole thing on my dime. using the credit card I'd given her for emergencies. I froze the card the next morning. It didn't take long for her to notice. Within hours, she was blowing up my phone, screaming that I'd ruined everything. "How could you do this to me?" she yelled. "You're trying to sabotage my happiness." I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. "Claire, if you're old enough to make adult decisions, you're old enough to handle the consequences. If you don't want me at your wedding, I'm not going to pay for it." Her response was exactly what I expected. She called me selfish, controlling, and heartless. She said I didn't care about her happiness and accused me of trying to ruin her life. But for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I loved Claire more than anything, but I couldn't keep enabling her bad decisions. If she wanted to act like an adult, she needed to learn what it meant to take responsibility for her actions. As much as it hurt, I knew I was doing the right thing. After freezing Claire's credit card, I knew things would only escalate. I didn't want it to come to this, but I wasn't about to bankroll a wedding I wasn't welcome at. That line was clear to me. If I wasn't invited, neither was my money. Claire didn't take it well. She stormed into the house that night, her face red with anger. "How could you do this to me, Dad?" she shouted as soon as she walked through the door. I stood my ground. "Claire, I've supported you your entire life. I've been there for everything, even when you didn't want me to be. But I'm not going to fund a wedding I'm not allowed to attend. That's not how this works." "You're just being selfish," she screamed. "You don't care about my happiness. You just want control over my life." Her words stung, but I stayed calm. "No, Claire, I care about your future. That's why I'm saying no. If you're old enough to make adult decisions, then you're old enough to deal with adult consequences." She stormed off to her room, slamming the door behind her. For the next few days, we barely spoke. She avoided me as much as possible, only coming out of her room to grab food or leave the house. The tension was suffocating, but I wasn't going to back down. I decided it was time to call for reinforcements. Claire had always been close to her grandmother, my mom, and I hoped she might have better luck talking some sense into her. My mom, Evelyn, is a no-nonsense woman in her 70s, who's never been afraid to speak her mind. She raised me with tough love, and I thought maybe that was what Claire needed right now. When I explained the situation to my mom, she sighed deeply. "That girl is just like her mother," she said. "Stubborn as a mule and too proud to admit when she's wrong. But I'll talk to her." We set up a family meeting, with my mom leading the conversation. Claire sat across from us, her arms crossed and her face set in a scowl. My mom didn't waste any time getting to the point. "Claire, marriage isn't just about love," she began. "It's about commitment, responsibility, and planning. Have you and Jake thought about any of that? How are you going to support yourselves? Do you have savings? A budget? A plan for the future?" Claire rolled her eyes. "We'll figure it out, Grandma. Times have changed. It's not like it was in your day." My mom's expression hardened. "You think times have changed, but the basics haven't. Love doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't keep a roof over your head or food on the table. You need a solid foundation to build a life together. And from what your dad's told me, you and Jake don't have that." Claire stayed silent, her arms still crossed. My mom went on, sharing stories about her own struggles when she and my dad first got married. She talked about the sacrifices they made, the financial hardships they faced, and how they had to work together to build a stable life. "Marriage isn't a fairy tale, Claire," she said. "It's hard work, and if you're not ready for that, it'll fall apart faster than you can imagine." Claire finally spoke, her voice cold and defiant. "You don't understand. Jake and I know what we're doing. We love each other, and that's all that matters." My mom shook her head. "You're making a mistake, and you're too stubborn to see it. But if you won't listen to me or your dad, then maybe you need to learn the hard way." With that, she stood up and left the room. I could see the frustration in her eyes, and I knew she felt just as helpless as I did. As much as I wanted to believe Claire would come to her senses, deep down, I knew she wouldn't. After I froze the credit card, she and Jake found a way to move forward with their wedding. When she came home one evening and slammed the door behind her, I didn't even need to ask. "We took out a loan," she announced, her voice laced with defiance. "You think you can stop this wedding? Guess what, Dad? It's happening whether you like it or not." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what she'd just said. "You took out a loan? Claire, do you even realize what you've done? You're barely an adult and now you're in debt before you've even started your life." "Don't lecture me," she snapped. "We're doing what we have to. Not that you care, since you abandoned me when I needed you the most." The way she twisted the narrative made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Claire, I didn't abandon you. You pushed me out. You banned me from your wedding. Don't turn this around on me." She rolled her eyes and stormed off to her room, slamming the door behind her. It was clear there was no getting through to her. A week later, the wedding took place. I wasn't invited, of course, but my neighbor Lily filled me in on the details. Lily's daughter was one of Claire's childhood friends, and she had attended the wedding out of obligation. It was okay, I guess, Lily told me when we bumped into each other at the grocery store. They had a small venue, some flowers, and even a live band, but you could tell the whole thing was thrown together at the last minute. She hesitated for a moment before adding, Jake's parents didn't look happy. They were polite, but you could see it all over their faces. They think this is a bad idea too. Hearing that didn't make me feel any better. I'd hoped that Jake's parents might have been able to talk some sense into him, but apparently they were just as powerless as I was. On the day of the wedding, I stayed home, trying to distract myself. I told myself it didn't matter, that it wasn't worth getting upset over. But deep down, I was heartbroken. Every father dreams of walking his daughter down the aisle, of seeing her start a new chapter in her life surrounded by love and support. Instead, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the walls and wondering where it all went wrong. Before Claire left for the ceremony, I slipped a note into her room. It wasn't much, just a few words wishing her the best and hoping she'd find happiness, even if I didn't agree with her choices. As much as I was against this wedding, I couldn't bring myself to wish ill on my own daughter. No matter how much she'd hurt me, I still wanted the best for her. A couple of months passed after the wedding, and things were quiet. Claire moved out of the house and into a small apartment with Jake. She didn't call, didn't visit, didn't even text. The silence was painful, but I told myself it was for the best. She needed to figure things out on her own, and I couldn't keep bailing her out every time she made a bad decision. Then, one evening, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I was surprised to see Jake standing there. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside and letting him in. "What's going on?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Jake sat down on the couch and rubbed his hands together nervously. "We're struggling," he admitted. "The loan payments are more than we expected, and rent's gone up. I've picked up extra shifts, but it's not enough. Claire's been applying for jobs, but, I knew exactly what he meant. Claire was a high school dropout with no real work experience. The kind of jobs she could get weren't going to pay much, and knowing her, she was probably being picky about what she was willing to do. We're behind on everything. Rent, utilities, the loan payments," Jake continued. "We're drowning, and I don't know what to do. I was hoping maybe you could help us out, just until we get back on our feet." I leaned back in my chair, staring at him. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him. He looked like he was genuinely struggling, and I could tell he was desperate. But another part of me couldn't forget the arrogance he'd shown when I'd tried to talk to him before the wedding. "Jake," I said, my voice steady, "when you and Claire decided to get married, you told me that love was all you needed. That money didn't matter. Do you still believe that?" He looked down at his hands, avoiding my gaze. "I was wrong," he muttered. I nodded. "I'm sorry you're struggling, but I can't help you. This is your mess, and you need to figure out how to fix it." Jake looked like I'd just punched him in the gut. "You won't even help a little? Just enough to get us through this rough patch?" "No," I said firmly. "Claire made it very clear that she didn't want me involved in her life. If that's how she feels, then I'm respecting her wishes." He sat there for a moment, his shoulders slumped, before finally standing up. "I understand," he said quietly. "Thanks anyway." As he walked to the door, I felt a pang of guilt, but I reminded myself that this was the only way they'd learn. If I bailed them out now, they'd never take responsibility for their decisions. That night, Claire called me for the first time since the wedding. She was furious. "How could you turn Jake away like that?" she yelled. "He came to you in good faith and you humiliated him." I sighed, already exhausted from the conversation I knew was coming. "Claire, you're the one who wanted me out of your life. You can't expect me to step in now just because things aren't going the way you planned." "You're heartless," she screamed. "You don't care about me at all." I stayed calm. "I care about you more than you realize. That's why I'm letting you face the consequences of your actions. This is what adulthood looks like, Claire. It's not all romance and fairy tales. It's hard work, and it's responsibility." She hung up on me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty. Update 1 point. A few weeks after Jake showed up at my door and Claire called me in a rage, I thought the dust had settled. Claire wasn't speaking to me, and I didn't try to reach out to her either. I figured she needed space to figure things out, and I wasn't going to push. As much as it hurt to see her struggling, I knew she had to learn this lesson on her own. Then, late one night, my phone buzzed. It was a string of frantic texts from Claire. Dad, are you awake? Please, I need to talk to you. I don't know what to do. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. My first thought was that something had happened to Jake. Maybe an accident or an emergency. I called her immediately. Claire, what's wrong? I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. There was a long pause on the other end, and when she finally spoke, her voice was shaking. I think I might be pregnant. I froze. Out of all the things I'd expected her to say, this wasn't one of them. Are you sure? I asked. No, she admitted. But I'm late and I have a feeling. She was crying now, and I could hear the fear in her voice. Dad, we can't handle this. We're already behind on rent and bills. How are we supposed to take care of a baby? I wanted to say, this is what you signed up for, but I couldn't bring myself to be that harsh. No matter how much Claire had hurt me, she was still my daughter, and she was scared. Okay, I said gently. The first step is to confirm it. I'll schedule a doctor's appointment for you tomorrow. Until then, take a deep breath and try not to panic. The next morning, I called a local clinic and set up an appointment for Claire. She was nervous the whole way there, biting her nails and fidgeting in the passenger seat. When we got to the clinic, I waited in the car while she went inside. About 30 minutes later, she came out and slid into the seat without saying a word. What did they say? I asked. They want me to wait a week before taking another test, she said quietly. It's too early to tell for sure. For the next week, Claire was a nervous wreck. She barely slept and spent most of her time pacing around the apartment she shared with Jake. She texted me constantly, asking for advice or just needing reassurance. I could tell she was terrified, and for the first time in months, she actually wanted my support. During one of our conversations, she brought up Jake. Dad, do you think you could hire him at your agency? Just for a little while until we get back on our feet? I run a small business, a creative agency that requires a specific set of skills. Jake didn't have those skills, and to be honest, I doubted he had the work ethic to learn them. But Claire was desperate, and I could feel the pressure building. Let's wait for the results of your test, I told her. We'll figure things out after that. But she wasn't satisfied. You're just making excuses, she snapped. Why can't you ever help when I need you? Her accusations stung, but I held my ground. Claire, I'm not going to make a decision until we know what we're dealing with. Let's take this one step at a time. Thankfully, the pregnancy scare turned out to be just that, a scare. When Claire got the results of her second test, she wasn't pregnant. I thought the relief might humble her, but instead, it seemed to make her even more defiant. You wouldn't even hire Jake, she said bitterly during one of our arguments. What kind of father doesn't help his daughter when she's struggling? I sighed. Claire, I've done nothing but try to help you your entire life, but you've made it clear that you don't want me involved. You can't have it both ways. She crossed her arms and glared at me. You know, everything you have is going to be mine one day. You could at least act like you care about my future. Her words floored me. Claire, nothing is guaranteed. You think you're entitled to everything I've worked for? That's not how it works. I might retire early or travel or even get married again. What I leave behind is up to me, not you. Her face twisted in anger. You're selfish, she spat. You don't care about anyone but yourself. I didn't even argue. There was no point. Over the next few weeks, our relationship grew colder. Claire stopped calling, and when I tried to reach out, she ignored me. I could feel the distance growing between us, and it broke my heart. I thought about giving in, sending her money or offering to help Jake find a job, but I knew it would only make things worse. Claire needed to learn the hard way. She needed to understand that her actions had consequences, and that she couldn't keep relying on me to bail her out. But that didn't make it any easier. Every day I thought about calling her, about trying to mend the rift between us. But I knew that as long as she refused to take responsibility for her choices, nothing would change. A few days ago, I got a call from my ex-wife, Stephanie. She was furious. How could you let Claire struggle like this? She demanded. She's your daughter. You're supposed to help her. I took a deep breath before responding. Stephanie, I've been helping Claire her whole life, but this isn't about me anymore. She made her choices, and now she has to live with them. Stephanie wasn't satisfied. You're ruining her life, she snapped. No, I said firmly. Claire is in charge of her own life now. If she wants things to change, she needs to take responsibility for herself. Stephanie hung up on me, and I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. I hated that things had come to this, but I didn't see any other way. Every day I hope that Claire will come around. I hope she'll see that I was only trying to protect her, that everything I did was out of love. But until that day comes, all I can do is wait. Update 2.0. A few months passed in silence. Claire and I weren't speaking, and any updates I got about her life came through our neighbor, Lily, or her few remaining friends. Most people had stopped reaching out to Claire because of her stubbornness and unwillingness to listen to advice. It was hard to watch her isolate herself, but I reminded myself that I needed to let her face the consequences of her decisions. Then, one evening, I got another late-night call. This time, it wasn't Claire. It was Jake. "Hey, Mr. Carter," he started, his voice shaky. "I know we haven't talked much since, well, you know, but I wanted to tell you that Claire isn't doing so great." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean? Is she okay?" "She's just really stressed. The bills are piling up, and she hasn't been able to find a job. We're fighting a lot. I don't know what to do anymore." For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But then I reminded myself that this was the situation they had chosen. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "But Jake, you two decided to get married against everyone's advice. You took out a loan to fund a wedding you couldn't afford. You both knew what you were getting into." "I know," he said quietly. "But I thought we could handle it. I didn't realize how hard it would be." Jake's call stayed on my mind for the rest of the week. As much as I wanted to step in and fix everything, I knew I couldn't. Claire and Jake needed to learn to navigate their own problems without relying on me. Then, out of the blue, Claire texted me. "I need to talk to you," she wrote. I called her immediately, and for the first time in months, she answered. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Jake and I are thinking about moving back in with his parents. We can't afford the apartment anymore, and we're falling behind on everything. I don't know what to do." This was the most vulnerable I'd heard Claire in a long time. For a moment, I considered offering to let them move back in with me, but then I thought about how things had played out the last time I tried to help her. She didn't want my advice or my rules. She just wanted my resources. "Have you talked to Jake's parents about it?" I asked instead. "Yeah," she said, her voice small. "They said we could move into their basement, but I don't want to live there. It feels like giving up." "Claire, sometimes you have to take a step back to move forward," I told her. "If moving in with his parents helps you get back on your feet, then that's what you need to do. It's not giving up. It's being practical." She didn't respond right away, and when she finally did, her tone was defensive. "You wouldn't understand. You've never had to go through this." I sighed. "Claire, I've made my share of mistakes, but I also learned from them. That's what you need to do. Learn and grow. I can't do it for you." A couple of weeks later, Claire and Jake moved into his parents' basement. According to Lily, things were tense between them and Jake's parents. His dad was frustrated with their lack of direction, and his mom was tired of cleaning up after them. One evening, Jake's dad called me. "Carter, I hate to bother you, but I'm at my wit's end with these two," he said. "They don't seem to realize how much work it takes to build a life together. They're still acting like teenagers." I felt a mix of frustration and sadness. "I get it," I said. "I tried to warn them, but they wouldn't listen. At this point, they have to figure it out on their own." Jake's dad sighed. "I just hope they figure it out before it's too late." As the months went by, things didn't improve. Claire and Jake were constantly arguing, and the financial strain was taking a toll on their relationship. One day, Claire called me crying. "Dad, I think Jake and I made a mistake," she said through her sobs. "What happened?" I asked, my heart sinking. "He's just not who I thought he was. He doesn't help around the house, and he spends all his time complaining about work. I feel like I'm doing everything on my own." I wanted to say, "I told you so," but I bit my tongue. Instead, I said, "Claire, marriage is hard. It takes effort from both people. Have you tried talking to him about how you're feeling?" "I've tried," she said, "but he doesn't listen. He just says I'm nagging him." For the first time, I heard doubt in her voice. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize the gravity of her decisions. Despite everything, Claire still hadn't apologized for banning me from her wedding, or for the way she'd treated me. Part of me wanted to let it go and focus on rebuilding our relationship, but another part of me couldn't forget how much her actions had hurt. One day, I brought it up during a phone call. "Claire, can we talk about the wedding?" I asked. "What about it?" she said, her tone defensive. "You banned me from one of the most important days of your life. Do you regret that?" There was a long pause before she answered. "I was angry," she admitted. "I felt like you didn't support me." "I was trying to protect you," I said. "I've always wanted what's best for you, even when it meant making tough decisions." She didn't respond, and I didn't push. I knew it would take time for her to fully understand the impact of her choices. As of now, Claire and I are in a better place than we were a few months ago, but things are far from perfect. She's still stubborn and proud, and I'm still struggling to find the balance between supporting her and letting her learn from her mistakes. Every day, I hope she'll come around and realize that I've always had her best interests at heart. But until then, I'm doing my best to be patient. Because that's what being a parent is. Loving your child even when they don't make it easy.
The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. I barely noticed the splash of bubbly on my new dress as I stared at Brad, my husband of 1 month, in disbelief. "What did you just say?" I managed to choke out, praying I'd misheard him. Brad's blue eyes, once so captivating, now seemed cold and distant. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and repeated the words that had just shattered my world. "I'm in love with someone else. Aubrey, I want a divorce." The elegant anniversary dinner I'd spent hours preparing lay forgotten on the table behind us. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls of our penthouse apartment. It should have been romantic. Instead, it felt like a cruel joke. "Who is she?" I demanded, my voice trembling. Brad hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "Isabel Hartley." The name hit me like a physical blow. Isabel Hartley, the socialite whose face graced every society page and charity gala in the city. I'd always known Brad had a wandering eye, but this... "How long?" I whispered. 6 months, Brad admitted. "I'm sorry, Aubrey, I never meant for this to happen." A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. "Never meant for it to happen? We've been married for 4 weeks, Brad. Did you even mean those vows?" He had the decency to look ashamed. "I thought I could make it work with us. I really did try." "Try?" I spat. "By sleeping with another woman behind my back?" Brad's expression hardened. "Look, I know this is a shock, but let's be adults about this. We can handle the divorce quietly. No need for a big scene." I gaped at him, fury rising to replace the initial shock. "A big scene? You drop this bomb on our anniversary and expect me to just roll over?" "Come on, Aubrey," Brad said, his tone patronizing. "You had to know deep down that this wasn't working. We've been drifting apart for years." "Because you've been cheating on me," I shouted, finally losing my composure. "God, how many times have I forgiven you? And now this." Brad's phone chimed. He glanced at it, then back at me. "I have to go. We can discuss the details later when you've calmed down." As he moved towards the door, something inside me snapped. I grabbed the nearest object, a crystal vase, another wedding gift, and hurled it at the wall. It exploded in a shower of glass, making Brad jump. "You want a divorce?" I snarled. "Fine. But don't think for a second I'm going to make this easy for you. I've stood by you for 10 years, Brad. I've forgiven every indiscretion, supported your career, been the perfect wife. No more." Brad's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "What are you saying?" I straightened my spine, meeting his gaze with steel in my own. "I'm saying that if you want out of this marriage, it's going to cost you. Big time. Now, Aubrey, let's not be hasty." "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Get out before I do something we'll both regret." Brad hesitated for a moment, then nodded curtly. As the door closed behind him, I sank to the floor, heedless of the broken glass. Tears threatened, but I blinked them back furiously. No more crying over Brad Thompson. No more being the understanding, forgiving wife. As I sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of my marriage, a new resolve began to form. Brad wanted a divorce? Fine. But he was about to learn that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. I reached for my phone with shaking hands. It was time to call a lawyer. I stared at the divorce papers spread across my kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of wine within easy reach. It had been 3 days since Brad's bombshell, and the shock was finally wearing off, replaced by a simmering anger that threatened to boil over at any moment. My phone buzzed. Another message from my best friend Lydia. "How are you holding up, sweetie? Need me to come over?" I sighed, typing out a quick reply. "I'm fine. Just going over everything with the lawyer tomorrow. Talk soon." The truth was, I didn't want to see anyone. I didn't want their pity or their well-meaning advice. What I wanted was justice. As I poured another glass of wine, memories of the past decade flooded back. The first time I caught Brad cheating, just 2 years into our relationship. His tearful apologies, promises to change, and like a fool, I believed him. Then there was the work trip to Vegas that turned out to be a weekend with his secretary. The flirtatious texts I found on his phone from countless women. Each time I forgave him. Each time I thought things would be different. "Never again," I muttered, taking a long swig of wine. The doorbell rang, startling me out of my bitter reverie. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered ignoring it. but something compelled me to answer. I wish I hadn't. Brad stood in the hallway looking annoyingly handsome in an expensive suit. "Aubrey," he said, his voice soft. "Can we talk?" Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door in his face. Instead, I stepped aside, letting him in. "Nice suit," I said coldly. "Isabel's taste, I assume?" Brad winced. "Look, I know you're angry." "Angry doesn't begin to cover it," I snapped. "What do you want, Brad?" He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I once found endearing. Now it just irritated me. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the alimony." I raised an eyebrow. "And?" "I'm willing to be generous," he said, pulling out a folded document. "I had my lawyer draw this up. It's a fair settlement, Aubrey. More than fair, actually." I snatched the paper from his hand, scanning the numbers. My eyes widened. It was indeed generous, far more than I'd expected. "Why?" I demanded, suspicion creeping in. "What's the catch?" Brad sighed. "No catch. I want to make this right, or as right as it can be, given the circumstances." For a moment, I almost believed him, almost fell for the sincere look in his eyes, the regretful tone in his voice. But then I remembered all the times I'd heard this before. "Make it right?" I laughed bitterly. "You can't make this right, Brad. You've humiliated me, betrayed me, and for what? Some socialite who'll probably toss you aside the moment someone richer comes along?" Brad's expression hardened. "That's not fair. Isabel and I—" "I don't want to hear it." I cut him off. "You know what? Keep your generous offer. I'll see you in court." I crumpled up the settlement offer and threw it at his chest. Brad's eyes widened in surprise. "Aubrey, don't be foolish," he warned. "This is more than you'd get in any court settlement. Think about your future." His condescending tone was the final straw. "My future?" I hissed. "My future was supposed to be with you, Brad. But you threw that away, so now I'm going to build a new future. One where I don't have to depend on your generosity or anyone else's." I yanked open the door. "Get out, and tell your lawyer to prepare for war." As the door slammed behind him, I leaned against it, heart pounding. Part of me screamed that I was making a mistake, that I should take the money and run. But a stronger part, a part I'd buried for far too long, whispered something else. It whispered of justice, of standing up for myself at last, of making Brad pay for every lie, every betrayal. I walked back to the kitchen, bypassing the wine glass for the bottle itself. Tomorrow I'd call my lawyer. Tomorrow the real fight would begin. And this time I wasn't backing down. I stood in the courthouse hallway, my heart pounding as I waited for my lawyer to emerge from the judge's chambers. The divorce proceedings had been a whirlwind, moving faster than I'd ever imagined possible. Brad's eagerness to settle had initially made me suspicious, but now I was beginning to understand why. The door opened and my lawyer Sarah strode out with a satisfied smile. "It's done, Aubrey. The judge approved the settlement." I blinked, stunned. "Just like that? What about the fight I was preparing for?" Sarah shrugged. "Sometimes we get lucky. Brad's lawyer pushed for a quick resolution, and the terms are more than fair. You're getting a very generous alimony package." As if summoned by his name, Brad appeared at the end of the hallway, Isabel clinging to his arm like an expensive accessory. My stomach churned at the sight of them together. "Congratulations, Aubrey," Brad said, his tone maddeningly cordial. "I hope this settlement helps you start fresh." I wanted to slap the smug look off his face. Instead, I forced a smile. "Oh, it will. Thank you for your generosity." Isabel's eyes narrowed. "Brad, darling, we'll be late for the charity gala. We should go." As they turned to leave, I couldn't resist one parting shot. "Enjoy the high life, Brad. I hope it's worth it." He paused, looking back at me with an unreadable expression. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. But then Isabel tugged on his arm, and they were gone. I let out a shaky breath. "It's really over, isn't it?" Sarah squeezed my shoulder. "It is. And you came out on top, Aubrey. The alimony alone will set you up comfortably for years." But as we left the courthouse, a nagging doubt gnawed at me. Why had Brad given in so easily? What was he hiding? Weeks passed, and I tried to settle into my new life as a single woman. The alimony checks arrived like clockwork, each one a reminder of the life I'd left behind. I should have felt victorious, relieved. Instead, I felt empty. One rainy afternoon, as I scrolled mindlessly through social media, a headline caught my eye. "Tech mogul Brad Thompson and socialite wife make splash at Hampton's gala." The photo showed Brad and Isabel dressed to the nines, champagne flutes in hand. They looked sickeningly happy, surrounded by the glitterati of New York's elite. Anger bubbled up inside me. While I sat alone in my apartment, Brad was living it up with his new wife, spending the money he'd built his company with during our marriage. I was about to close the app when another headline made me freeze. Thompson Tech stock soars after surprise merger announcement. My hands shaking, I clicked the link. Brad's company, the one he'd started with seed money from my family, had just merged with a major Silicon Valley firm. The deal was worth billions. Suddenly, Brad's eagerness to settle, his generous alimony, it all made sense. He'd known this merger was coming. He'd rushed the divorce through before the news broke, before the true value of his assets could be calculated. I'd been played. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. I felt sick, betrayed all over again. Not just by Brad, but by the system that was supposed to protect me, to ensure a fair division of our marital assets. As I sat there surrounded by the trappings of my old life, a cold determination settled over me. Brad thought he'd won, that he'd outsmarted me one last time. But he'd underestimated me, again. I picked up my phone, my fingers flying over the keys as I composed an email to Sarah. It was time to reopen the case. Time to show Brad and the world that Aubrey Thompson wasn't going down without a fight. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about justice. And I was going to get mine, no matter what it took. I stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen, willing the words to come. The website for my fledgling interior design business sat half-finished, a digital representation of my stalled life. It had been 3 months since the divorce, and I was struggling to find my footing. The alimony checks from Brad sat untouched in my bank account. Using that money felt like admitting defeat, like letting him win all over again. But my savings were dwindling, and the rent on this apartment, our old apartment, was due soon. A knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. I opened it to find Lydia, arms laden with takeout bags. "Intervention time," she announced, breezing past me into the kitchen. "You've been ghosting everyone for weeks. Enough is enough." I sighed, following her. "I'm fine, Lydia, just busy with the new business." She fixed me with a skeptical look. "Uh-huh. And how's that going?" I gestured helplessly at my laptop. "It's a work in progress." Lydia's expression softened. "Sweetie, you can't keep punishing yourself. What happened with Brad wasn't your fault." "Wasn't it?" I countered, the bitterness I'd been suppressing bubbling to the surface. I was the one who kept forgiving him, who believed his lies. And now look at me, hiding in this apartment while he's out there living his best life with Isabel. Lydia grabbed my shoulders, forcing me to meet her gaze. "Listen to me, Aubrey. You are not the villain in this story. You're the hero. It's time you started acting like it." Her words hit me like a splash of cold water. She was right. I'd been wallowing in self-pity, letting Brad's betrayal define me. It was time to take control of my narrative. With newfound determination, I turned back to my laptop. "Help me finish this website," I said to Lydia. "It's time to launch this business for real." We worked through the night, fueled by takeout and determination. By dawn, Aubrey's Interiors was live, my portfolio of past projects proudly displayed for the world to see. As the sun rose, my phone pinged with a notification, my first client inquiry, then another and another. Lydia squealed, hugging me tight. "See? You've got this." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I could do this after all. But life, as I was learning, had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. A week later, as I was preparing for my first official client meeting, my phone rang. It was Sarah, my lawyer. "Aubrey, we have a problem," she said, her voice tense. "Brad's lawyers are contesting the divorce settlement. They're claiming you knew about the merger before signing and are accusing you of fraud." The room spun around me. "What? That's ridiculous. I had no idea." "I know," Sarah cut in, "but they're pushing hard. If they win, you could lose everything. The alimony, the apartment, all of it." I sank onto the couch, my mind reeling. Just when I thought I was moving forward, Brad found a way to drag me back into his web of lies. "What do we do?" I whispered. Sarah's voice was grim. "We fight. But Aubrey, I need to know. Is there anything at all that could support their claims? Any conversations with Brad about the company before the divorce?" I racked my brain. thinking back to those tumultuous weeks. Then, with a jolt, I remembered, the night Brad came over with the settlement offer. He'd mentioned something about his company, about the future. I'd been too angry to pay attention at the time, but now... There might be, I admitted, my stomach churning, but Sarah, I swear I didn't know about the merger. I believe you, she said, but a good lawyer could twist this. We need to be prepared for a tough battle. As I hung up the phone, I stared at my newly launched website. The dream I'd just begun to build was already under threat. In that moment, I made a decision. I wouldn't let Brad destroy me again. If he wanted a fight, he'd get one. But this time, I'd be ready. I picked up my phone, dialing Lydia's number. "I need your help," I said when she answered. "It's time to dig up every bit of dirt we can find on Brad Thompson. No more playing nice." The game had changed, and I was determined to win. I never thought I'd find myself skulking outside a high-end restaurant, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Through the window, I could see Brad and Isabel laughing with a group of well-heeled socialites. The sight made my blood boil. "Are you sure about this?" Lydia whispered beside me. I nodded grimly. "We need dirt on Brad, and his new crowd is our best bet." We'd spent weeks digging into Brad's life, looking for anything to counter his fraud accusations. So far, we'd come up empty. But tonight, Brad was dining with Isabel's father, a notoriously shady businessman. If there was dirt to be found, it would be here. As the group exited the restaurant, Lydia and I ducked behind a parked car. Brad's voice carried in the night air. "Don't worry, Richard," he was saying to Isabel's father. "The SEC won't find anything. I've made sure of it." My heart raced. SEC? What had Brad gotten himself into? We trailed them to a nearby bar, slipping inside and finding a secluded booth. Brad and his group were at the bar, drinks flowing freely. As the night wore on, their voices grew louder, less guarded. "Another round," Brad called, his words slightly slurred, "to outsmarting the government and my ex-wife." Laughter erupted from the group. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to march over and confront him. "Easy," Lydia murmured, placing a hand on my arm. "We're here for information, remember?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. That's when I heard it. Brad, bragging about cooking the books for his recent merger. "It was easy," he boasted. "Those idiots at the SEC don't have a clue. And Aubrey? She signed away her rights without even realizing what she was giving up." The words hit me like a physical blow. Brad hadn't just cheated on me, he'd committed fraud and used our divorce to cover his tracks. Suddenly, Isabel's shrill voice cut through the din. "Brad, darling, isn't that your ex-wife?" I froze, realizing too late that in my shock I'd stood up from our booth. Brad's eyes met mine across the room, widening in recognition and then narrowing in anger. "Time to go," Lydia hissed, grabbing my arm. We bolted for the exit, but Brad was faster. He caught up to us on the sidewalk, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. "What the hell are you doing here, Aubrey?" he demanded. I straightened my spine, meeting his gaze. "Just having a drink, Brad. Is that a crime?" "Don't play dumb," he snarled. "You were spying on me. What did you hear?" "Enough," I shot back. "Enough to know that you're not just a cheater but a criminal, too." Brad's face paled. For a moment, I thought he might hit me. Instead, he leaned in close, his breath hot on my face. "Listen carefully," he hissed. "You breathe a word of what you heard tonight to anyone, and I'll make sure you lose everything. The alimony, your precious little business, all of it. Do you understand me?" I should have been terrified. Instead, a strange calm washed over me. In that moment, I saw Brad for what he truly was. A bully, a coward, and a fraud. "No, Brad," I said quietly. "You listen. I'm not the same woman you married. I'm not afraid of you anymore. So go ahead, try to take everything from me. But remember this. I know your secrets now, and I'm not afraid to use them." I turned on my heel, leaving Brad sputtering on the sidewalk. As Lydia and I hurried away, my mind raced. I had the information I needed now, but using it came with enormous risk. If I exposed Brad's fraud, I could lose everything in the ensuing legal battle. But if I stayed silent, could I live with myself? As we reached my apartment, I made my decision. I turned to Lydia, my voice steady. "Call Sarah," I said. "It's time to fight fire with fire." The battle lines were drawn, and this time I was ready for war. I stared at the television in disbelief, my coffee slipping from my fingers and shattering on the floor. Brad's face filled the screen, his usual confident smirk replaced by a look of panic. "Breaking news," the anchor announced. Tech mogul Brad Thompson's company, Thompson Tech, is under investigation by the SEC for alleged fraud and insider trading. My phone erupted with notifications. Texts from Lydia, calls from Sarah, even messages from old mutual friends I hadn't spoken to in months. Everyone wanted to know, had I known? Was I involved? I ignored them all, my eyes glued to the screen as more details emerged. The merger that had made Brad millions was now unraveling, dragging down not just his company but several others connected to Isabel's family. A knock at the door startled me. I opened it to find Sarah, looking grim. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me into the apartment. "The SEC wants to question you about Brad's activities during your marriage." My stomach dropped. "But I didn't know anything." Sarah's expression was sympathetic but firm. "They don't know that, and given the timing of your divorce and the merger, they think I was in on it," I finished, feeling sick. As Sarah outlined our legal options, my mind raced. I thought of the night at the bar, of Brad's drunken boasts. I had evidence that could bury him, but using it meant admitting I'd been spying on him. It could make me look complicit. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Aubrey?" Isabel's voice, usually so haughty, now sounded desperate. "Please, you have to help us. He's not handling this well." I laughed bitterly. "And why should I care?" "Because," Isabel's voice broke, "he's threatening to implicate you. He says if he goes down, he's taking you with him." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I ended the call, turning to Sarah with wide eyes. "We have a problem." Hours later, I sat in a sleek conference room, facing a team of stern-faced SEC investigators. Sarah sat beside me, a reassuring presence as I recounted my marriage to Brad, the divorce, everything I knew about his business dealings. "Mrs. Thompson," one investigator leaned forward, "are you aware that your ex-husband claims you had full knowledge of the merger and its irregularities?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I am now, but it's not true. Brad kept me in the dark about his business dealings throughout our marriage." "Can you prove that?" I hesitated, then nodded. "I can, but I need assurances that I won't be implicated for how I obtained this information." The investigators exchanged glances. "Go on," I recounted the night at the bar, playing the audio recording I'd secretly made on my phone. Brad's drunken confessions filled the room, damning him with every word. As the recording ended, a heavy silence fell. The lead investigator nodded slowly. "This changes things. Mrs. Thompson, we'll need you to come in for a formal statement." I left the SEC offices feeling drained but oddly liberated. I'd taken a risk, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control of my own story. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "You'll regret this." I should have been scared. Instead, I felt a surge of determination. Brad had underestimated me for the last time. As I hailed a cab, my phone rang again. This time, it was my biggest client, calling to cancel our contract in light of the scandal. In the span of a day, I'd become toxic by association. I leaned back in the cab, closing my eyes. I'd done the right thing, but at what cost? My business, my reputation, my future, everything I'd worked so hard to rebuild was now hanging by a thread. But as the city lights blurred past the window, I made a silent vow. I'd survived Brad's betrayal once. I would survive this too. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it head-on. Little did I know, the real battle was just beginning. The pounding on my door jolted me awake. I glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m. My heart raced as I approached the door, peering through the peephole. What I saw made my blood run cold. Brad stood there, disheveled and wild-eyed, a far cry from the polished executive I'd once known. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. "Aubrey, please," his voice cracked. "I know you're in there. I need your help." Against my better judgment, I opened the door. Brad stumbled in, reeking of alcohol and desperation. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, keeping my distance. Brad's eyes darted around the room. "It's all falling apart, Aubrey. The company, the merger, everything. Isabel left me. Her family's lawyers are circling like vultures." "And this concerns me how?" I crossed my arms, fighting to keep my voice steady. He ran a shaking hand through his hair. "I'm sorry for everything. I was a fool, Aubrey. I threw away the best thing in my life for what? A life that was all smoke and mirrors." I'd imagined this moment so many times, Brad broken, apologizing, But now that it was happening, I felt nothing but a cold, hard anger. "You're only sorry because you got caught," I said flatly. "If your schemes had worked out, you'd still be living it up with Isabel, wouldn't you?" Brad's face crumpled. "No, that's not true. I've realized." "Save it," I cut him off. "What do you want, Brad? Why are you really here?" He took a deep breath. "I need your help. The SEC, they're building a case against me. But if you testify that you knew about the merger, that you were involved..." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want me to perjure myself, to go down with you?" "Please, Aubrey," he begged, reaching for my hand. I jerked away. "We were a team once. We could be again. I still love you." For a moment I saw a flicker of the man I'd once loved, the man I'd forgiven time and time again. But then I remembered the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, the humiliation of discovering his affairs, the way he'd discarded me for a younger model. "No," I said, my voice steel. "We're not a team, Brad. We haven't been for a long time. And you don't love me. You love what I represent. A way out of the mess you've made." Brad's face hardened. "You owe me, Aubrey, that alimony you've been living on. My money built your precious little business." I laughed bitterly. "Your money? You mean the money you defrauded from investors? The money you used to buy your way into Isabel's world?" "Be careful," Brad growled, taking a step towards me. "You don't want to make an enemy of me." Fear flashed through me, but I stood my ground. "No, Brad, you don't want to make an enemy of me. I have the recording, remember? One call to the SEC and..." Brad lunged at me, his eyes wild. I stumbled backwards, knocking over a lamp. The crash seemed to snap him out of it. He stared at his hands in horror. "Oh God, Aubrey, I'm sorry." "I didn't mean..." "Get out," I said, my voice shaking. "Get out now, or I'm calling the police." Brad's shoulders slumped in defeat. As he shuffled towards the door, he turned back one last time. "I really am sorry, Aubrey, for everything." The door closed behind him, and I sank to the floor, trembling. I'd stood my ground, but at what cost? Brad was desperate, unpredictable. What if he made good on his threats? My phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "SEC wants to meet tomorrow. Urgent." I closed my eyes, exhaustion washing over me. In a few hours, I'd have to face the investigators again. I'd have to decide once and for all, protect myself or tell the whole truth and risk everything. As dawn broke over the city, I made my choice. Whatever came next, I was done living in Brad's shadow. It was time to write my own story, no matter the consequences. I stood in the courtroom, my heart pounding as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Months had passed since that night. Brad showed up at my door, desperate and unhinged. In that time, my world had been turned upside down. The SEC investigation had been brutal. Every aspect of my life with Brad had been scrutinized, every financial decision questioned. I'd lost clients, friends, and more than a few nights' sleep. But I'd stood my ground, telling the truth even when it hurt. Now, as I waited for the judge's decision, I caught Brad's eye across the courtroom. He looked haggard, a shell of the man who'd once commanded boardrooms. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. Then I remembered all the pain he'd caused, and my resolve hardened. "In the matter of the United States versus Bradley Thompson," the judge began, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "This court finds the defendant guilty on all counts of fraud and insider trading." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. I closed my eyes, a mix of relief and sadness washing over me. It was over. Finally, truly over. As the judge detailed Brad's sentence, years in prison, millions in fines, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I'd told the truth, consequences be damned, and justice had prevailed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, shouting questions. I pushed through them, ignoring the cameras and microphones thrust in my face. Lydia was waiting by the curb, a supportive smile on her face. "You did it, Aubrey," she said, pulling me into a hug. "It's over." But it wasn't over. Not really. As we drove away from the courthouse, I knew the hardest part was just beginning. I had to rebuild. My life, my business, my trust in myself. Months passed. Slowly, painstakingly, I pieced my world back together. My interior design business, nearly destroyed by the scandal, began to recover. Clients who'd abandoned me started to return, drawn by my newfound reputation for integrity. One day, as I was finishing up a consultation with a new client, I noticed a man lingering by my office door. He was handsome, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Can I help you?" I asked, curious. He stepped forward, extending his hand. "I'm David. I hope this isn't too forward, but I've been following your story in the news. What you did, standing up to your ex-husband like that, it was incredibly brave. I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. Thank you. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. David's smile widened. I was wondering if you might like to grab coffee sometime? To talk about interior design, of course, he added with a wink. For a moment, I hesitated. The wounds from Brad's betrayal were still fresh. But as I looked into David's eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine admiration and respect. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with my boldness. As David and I walked out of my office chatting easily, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same one who'd stood shell-shocked in her kitchen all those months ago, listening to her husband confess his affair. This woman was stronger, wiser, and unafraid to stand up for herself. She'd faced her worst fears and come out the other side, battered but unbroken. I thought of Brad, sitting in his prison cell, stripped of the wealth and status he'd valued above all else. I no longer felt anger or bitterness towards him. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. His betrayal had forced me to confront my own strength, to rebuild my life on my terms. In trying to destroy me, he'd inadvertently set me free. As David held the door open for me, I stepped out into the sunlight, ready to embrace whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I was excited to face it. My story wasn't over. It was just beginning. I do, I said, my voice trembling with a mix of joy and trepidation. The words echoed through the small chapel, sealing my fate in ways I couldn't have imagined. Joe beamed at me, his dark eyes twinkling with love and promise. As we turned to face our small gathering of family and friends, I caught sight of my new mother-in-law, Brenda. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Hartley, the officiant announced. The room erupted in applause, but I barely heard it. My mind was racing, replaying the whirlwind romance that had led to this moment. Just 6 months ago, I was drowning in grief after losing my mother. Now, here I was, starting a new chapter of my life. As we made our way down the aisle, Joe squeezed my hand. "You okay, Lily?" he whispered. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just overwhelmed," I replied. The reception was a blur of congratulations and champagne toasts. I found myself constantly searching the crowd for Brenda, feeling an inexplicable need to keep her in my sights. "Lily, darling." Brenda's saccharine voice cut through the chatter. She glided towards us, arms outstretched. "Welcome to the family, dear." Her embrace was stiff, her perfume cloying. As she pulled away, she gripped my shoulders, her manicured nails digging in slightly. "We're going to be so close, you and I, like mother and daughter." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Joe, oblivious to the tension, wrapped an arm around his mother. "Isn't this great, Mom? I couldn't be happier." Brenda's eyes never left mine. "Oh yes, it's just wonderful." The rest of the evening passed in a haze. As we prepared to leave for our honeymoon, Brenda cornered me near the coat check. "Lily, dear," she began, her voice low, "I hate to bring this up on your special day, but I've been so worried lately." I frowned, concern creeping in. "What's wrong, Brenda?" She sighed dramatically. "It's just, the house feels so empty since Joe moved out. I'm not as young as I used to be, you know." The thought of living alone? My heart sank as I realized where this was going. Before I could respond, Joe appeared at my side. "Ready to go, Mrs. Hartley?" he asked, grinning. I nodded, grateful for the interruption. As we walked away, I glanced back to see Brenda watching us, a calculating look in her eyes. 2 weeks later, we returned from our honeymoon to find Brenda waiting on our doorstep, suitcases in tow. "Surprise!" she exclaimed, rushing to embrace Joe. "I've decided to take you up on your offer to stay for a while." Joe looked bewildered. "Offer? Mom, what are you talking about?" Brenda's lower lip trembled. "Oh, Joey, don't you remember? We discussed it at the wedding. You said I should come stay with you and Lily if I was feeling lonely." I watched in horror as Joe's face softened. "Of course. Mom, I'm sorry, I must have forgotten. Right, Lily? We did discuss this, didn't we?" Trapped, I nodded weakly. "Yes, of course. Welcome, Brenda." As we helped her move her belongings inside, I caught Brenda smirking at me when Joe wasn't looking. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the battle I was about to face. That night, as Joe slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. How had my fresh start turned into this? I was a doctor, for heaven's sake. I saved lives every day. Surely, I could handle one meddling mother-in-law. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would test every ounce of my strength and patience. The shrill beeping of my alarm jolted me awake. I groaned, reaching for my phone to silence it. 4:30 a.m. Another early shift at the ER. As I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Joe, I caught a whiff of something burning. Panic surged through me as I rushed downstairs, only to find Brenda in the kitchen, surrounded by smoke. "Oh, good morning, dear," she chirped, waving a dishcloth at the smoking toaster. "I thought I'd make you breakfast before your shift." I forced a smile, my heart still racing. "That's thoughtful, Brenda, but I really need to get ready." Her face fell. "But I went to all this trouble. The least you could do is sit down and eat." Guilt gnawed at me as I glanced at the clock. "I'm sorry, I just don't have time." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "I see. Well, don't let me keep you from your important work." The drive to the hospital was tense, my mind replaying Brenda's words. By the time I arrived, I was already exhausted. "Rough night, Dr. Hartley?" my colleague Sarah asked as I entered the ER. I sighed. "You have no idea." The shift was brutal. A multi-car pileup had us working nonstop for hours. As I was finishing up with a patient, my phone buzzed. A text from Joe. "Mom says you left without eating. Everything okay?" I bit back a groan. Before I could respond, Sarah called out, "Lily, we need you. Cardiac arrest coming in." By the time I got home, I was dead on my feet. The house was spotless, and the aroma of a home-cooked meal filled the air. "Welcome home, honey," Joe greeted me with a kiss. "Mom made dinner. Isn't she amazing?" Brenda appeared, all smiles. "I hope you're hungry, Lily. I've been cooking all day." I plastered on a smile. "It smells wonderful. Thank you, Brenda." As we sat down to eat, Brenda dominated the conversation, regaling Joe with tales of her day. I pushed my food around, too tired to eat. "Lily, dear," Brenda's voice cut through my haze. "Don't you like the food? I made it especially for you." "It's delicious," I lied. "I'm just tired." Joe frowned. "Maybe you're working too hard, honey. Mom was saying earlier that she's worried about you." I looked up, startled. "She was?" Brenda nodded, her eyes wide with feigned concern. "Of course, dear. I told Joey how you rushed out this morning without eating. It's not healthy." "I had an early shift," I started to explain, but Brenda cut me off. "And you're always so tired when you get home. It's not fair to Joey, is it? He needs a wife, not a zombie." Joe shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I'm sure Lily's doing her best." "Of course she is." Brenda patted his hand. I just worry, that's all. Maybe if she cut back her hours." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "I'm going to bed. Good night." As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard Joe and Brenda's muffled voices downstairs. My stomach churned with anxiety. How had I become the bad guy in my own home? The next morning, I woke to find a note from Joe. "Had to leave early for a meeting. Mom's making breakfast. Love you." I steeled myself before heading downstairs. Brenda was at the stove, humming cheerfully. "Good morning, Lily," she said without turning around. "I hope you slept well. I was just telling Joey how worried I am about you." I gritted my teeth. "Brenda, we need to talk." She turned, her face a mask of innocence. "Of course, dear. What about?" As I opened my mouth to speak, my phone rang. The hospital. Another emergency. Brenda's lips curved into a smirk. "Duty calls, I suppose. We'll talk later, dear. Have a good day at work." As I rushed out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing control of my life, one day at a time. The ER doors burst open as paramedics rushed in with a critical patient. "Female, mid-60s, possible heart attack," one shouted. My heart nearly stopped. The woman on the gurney was Brenda. "Lily," she gasped, reaching for my hand. "I'm so sorry." I pushed my emotions aside and snapped into doctor mode. "Get her to Bay 3, stat!" Hours later, I slumped against the wall outside Brenda's room, exhausted. We'd stabilized her, but it had been touch and go. Joe appeared, his face pale with worry. "How is she?" "She's stable," I assured him, "but she'll need to stay for observation." He hugged me tightly. "Thank God you were here. I don't know what I'd do without either of you." Guilt gnawed at me. Despite everything, I'd saved Brenda's life. But as I watched Joe fuss over his mother, I couldn't help but wonder, would she see this as a peace offering or another reason to resent me? The next few days were a whirlwind. I juggled my shifts with visiting Brenda, all while trying to keep our home running smoothly. Joe was a constant presence at his mother's bedside, leaving me to handle everything else. On the day of Brenda's discharge, I arrived at the hospital to find her holding court with a group of nurses. "Oh, Lily dear," she cooed as I entered. "I was just telling these lovely ladies how fortunate I am to have such a dedicated daughter-in-law. She's been working herself to the bone, hasn't she?" The nurses nodded sympathetically, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this experience had changed things between us. That hope was short-lived. As soon as we got home, Brenda's sweet facade crumbled. "Well, I suppose I should be grateful you didn't let me die," she sniffed. "Though it would have been nice if you'd visited more. Poor Joey was so worried." I bit my tongue, reminding myself she was still recovering. "I'm sorry, Brenda. I was trying to keep things running smoothly here." She waved dismissively. Yes, always so busy with your important job. Speaking of which, don't you think it's time you took a break? After all, I'll need someone to look after me while I recover." My jaw dropped. "Brenda, I can't just quit my job." "Why not?" she challenged. "Joey makes enough to support us all. And really, Lily, what kind of wife puts her career before her family?" Before I could respond, Joe walked in. "Everything okay in here?" Brenda's eyes instantly filled with tears. "Oh, Joey, I was just telling Lily how overwhelmed I feel. The doctor said I need constant care, and with Lily working such long hours." Joe frowned, turning to me. "Honey, maybe you should take some time off, just until Mom's back on her feet." I stared at him, disbelieving. "Joe, I can't just—" "Please, Lily," he pleaded. "For me, for us." I felt the walls closing in. My career, my independence, everything I'd worked for was slipping away. That night, I tossed and turned, Joe's words echoing in my head. By morning, I'd made my decision. With shaking hands, I dialed the hospital. "Dr. Reeves? It's Lily Hartley. I need to take a leave of absence." As I hung up, I caught sight of Brenda in the doorway, a triumphant smile on her face. "Oh, Lily," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I'm so glad you're finally putting family first. Now be a dear and fetch my breakfast, won't you? I'm feeling a bit weak this morning." As I trudged downstairs, the reality of my situation hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd saved Brenda's life, only to become a prisoner in my own home. How had it come to this? And more importantly, how was I going to survive it? The days blurred together in a haze of endless chores and Brenda's constant demands. I'd gone from saving lives to folding laundry and preparing meals that were never quite good enough for my mother-in-law's discerning palate. "Lily, dear," Brenda's shrill voice pierced through my thoughts. "Be a lamb and fetch my reading glasses." I seemed to have misplaced them again. I bit back a sigh, forcing a smile. "Of course, Brenda. I'll look for them right away." As I searched the house, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at me was a stranger, pale, tired, with dark circles under her eyes. What had happened to the confident doctor I used to be? "Lily," Brenda called again, impatience lacing her tone. "What's taking so long?" I found the glasses perched on top of her head and wordlessly handed them to her. She sniffed. "Really, Lily? You'd think a doctor would be more observant. Oh, wait. You're not a doctor anymore, are you?" The word stung, but I swallowed my retort. Joe would be home soon, and I couldn't bear another argument. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, Brenda launched into her usual critique of my cooking. "The chicken's a bit dry, don't you think, Joey? And these vegetables are terribly overcooked." Joe, engrossed in his phone, merely grunted in response. "You know," Brenda continued, "I was thinking, now that Lily's not working, perhaps we should consider redecorating. This house could use a woman's touch." I nearly choked on my water. "Excuse me?" Brenda waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry, dear. I'll handle everything. After all, I have much more experience in these matters." "This is our home, Brenda," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed anger. "Joe and I like it the way it is." She turned to Joe, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "Joey, don't you think the house could use some sprucing up? Your father and I always kept our home so lovely." Joe finally looked up from his phone. Yeah, sure. Whatever you think, Mom." I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. I need some air. Outside, I gulped in the cool night air, trying to calm my racing heart. How had I let things get this far? I was a prisoner in my own home, my identity slowly being erased by Brenda's constant manipulations. As I paced the backyard, a memory surfaced. My mother's voice, strong and clear. Never let anyone dim your light, Lily. You're meant to shine. Tears pricked my eyes. What would my mom think if she could see me now? The back door creaked open and Joe stepped out. Lily? You okay? I turned to face him, suddenly angry. No, Joe. I'm not okay. I haven't been okay for a long time. He frowned. What are you talking about? Your mother, Joe. The way she treats me, the way she's taken over our lives. I can't do this anymore. Joe's face hardened. Come on, Lily. Mom's just trying to help. You're being oversensitive. Oversensitive? I laughed bitterly. I gave up my career, my independence, everything for you and your mother. And you can't even see what's happening. What's happening is that you're acting ungrateful, Joe snapped. Mom's done nothing but try to make our lives easier? I stared at him, realizing with a sinking heart that I was truly alone in this battle. You're right, Joe. I am ungrateful. Ungrateful that I married a man who can't see his wife drowning right in front of him. With that, I stormed past him into the house, ignoring Brenda's inquiring looks. In our bedroom, I pulled out a suitcase and began throwing clothes into it. As I zipped it shut, I caught sight of my medical ID badge lying forgotten on the dresser. I picked it up, running my thumb over my name and title. Dr. Lily Hartley, Emergency Medicine. In that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't change Brenda, and I couldn't make Joe see the truth. But I could change myself. It was time to reclaim my life, whatever the cost. I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by a whirlwind of activity, my hands raw from scrubbing and chopping. Brenda's voice rang out from the living room where she sat directing operations like a general. Lily, dear, don't forget the petit fours need to be arranged just so, and make sure the champagne is properly chilled. I gritted my teeth, fighting back the urge to scream. Brenda's grand party had consumed our lives for weeks. My suitcase, packed in a moment of desperation, still sat hidden in our closet. I hadn't been able to bring myself to leave, not yet. Joe breezed into the kitchen, adjusting his tie. Wow, honey, everything looks great. Mom's really outdone herself this time, hasn't she? I froze, the knife in my hand trembling slightly. Joe, I've been cooking and cleaning for days. Your mother hasn't lifted a finger. He frowned, confusion clouding his features. But Mom said she's been working tirelessly on this party. She even mentioned how you've been struggling to keep up. Before I could respond, Brenda swept into the room, resplendent in a glittering gown. Joey, darling, don't you look handsome? Lily, why aren't you dressed yet? The guests will be arriving any minute. I looked down at my flour-stained apron and disheveled appearance. I've been busy preparing everything, Brenda. I haven't had time to... Tsk, tsk, Brenda interrupted, shaking her head. Really, Lily, I expected better from you. This party is so important to me. Couldn't you have made more of an effort? Joe shifted uncomfortably. Mom, maybe you're being a little harsh. Lily's been working hard. Brenda's eyes welled with tears. Oh, Joey, I'm just so disappointed. I wanted everything to be perfect. After all I've been through, is that too much to ask? As Joe moved to comfort his mother, the doorbell rang. Guests had begun to arrive. Lily, go make yourself presentable, Brenda ordered, her tone brooking no argument. And do hurry. The next few hours were a blur of forced smiles and polite small talk. I circulated the room, refilling glasses and passing hors d'oeuvres, all while Brenda held court, regaling her friends with tales of her recovery and how she'd single-handedly planned this magnificent soiree. And of course, I couldn't have done it without my dear daughter-in-law, Brenda announced, beckoning me over. Lily, darling, come here and tell everyone how much you've enjoyed helping me. All eyes turned to me, expectant. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my back as I struggled to find words. I'm always happy to help family, I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Brenda's smile tightened. Oh, come now, Lily. Don't be modest. Tell them about all the wonderful ideas you contributed. Oh, wait, she paused, her eyes glittering maliciously. I forgot. You didn't contribute any ideas, did you? You were too busy moping about your lost career to be of any real help. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Joe, standing nearby, looked stricken. Mom, what are you saying? Brenda turned to him, her face a mask of innocence. Oh, Joey, I'm just trying to help Lily come out of her shell. She's been so withdrawn lately. I worry about her, you know. I stood there, humiliation burning through me, as Brenda continued to twist the knife. The room began to spin, voices blurring into a cacophony of whispers and judgmental stares. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I wouldn't take this anymore. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the room, ignoring the startled exclamations behind me. I climbed the stairs, my legs shaking, and entered our bedroom. The suitcase was still there, waiting. As I reached for it, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was a stranger, beaten down, hollow-eyed, a shadow of her former self. But in her eyes, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen in months: determination. I grabbed the suitcase and my car keys. It was time to reclaim my life, my identity. As I descended the stairs, I could hear Brenda's voice, still holding court in the living room. Joe appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes widening as he took in my appearance. "Lily, what are you doing?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'm leaving, Joe. I can't do this anymore." As I walked past him towards the door, I realized that this wasn't just about escaping Brenda's tyranny. It was about finding myself again, the strong, capable woman I used to be. And for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. I stood at the front door, my hand on the knob, ready to walk out on everything I'd known for the past year. Joe's voice, tinged with panic, cut through my resolve. "Lily, please, don't do this. We can talk about it." I turned to face him, my voice steady. "There's nothing left to say, Joe. I can't live like this anymore." Just as I opened the door, a commotion from the living room caught our attention. A woman's voice, filled with excitement, rose above the murmur of the party. "It's her! It's really her!" Curiosity overrode my desire to flee. I followed Joe back to the party, where we found a silver-haired woman pointing at me, her eyes wide with recognition. "You're Dr. Hartley, aren't you? The one who saved my life at Rosie's Cafe last year." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. I recognized the woman now, Abigail Thompson, the patient I'd resuscitated during my lunch break months ago. Yes, that's me," I stammered, caught off guard by this unexpected turn of events. Abigail rushed forward, grasping my hands. "I've been trying to find you for months to thank you properly. You disappeared from the hospital before I could." Brenda, looking flustered, tried to interject. "Now, Abigail, dear, this is hardly the time." But Abigail was unstoppable. She turned to the crowd, her voice ringing with emotion. "This woman is a hero. She performed CPR on me when I had a heart attack, kept me alive until the ambulance arrived. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for her quick thinking and skill." The room erupted in applause and exclamations of admiration. I stood there, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in attention. Joe looked at me with a mixture of pride and confusion. Abigail continued, "But wait, I don't understand. Brenda told us you were just a housewife. Why aren't you practicing medicine anymore?" The room fell silent once again. I could feel Brenda's glare burning into me, daring me to speak the truth. In that moment, something inside me broke free. The months of suppressed anger, frustration, and pain came pouring out. "I gave up my career because of Brenda," I said, my voice gaining strength with each word. "She manipulated her way into our home, made me feel worthless, and slowly stripped away everything that made me who I am." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Joe's face paled as he looked between me and his mother. Brenda, her face contorted with rage, stepped forward. "How dare you? After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me, by humiliating me in front of my friends." Abigail, sensing the tension, placed a protective hand on my arm. "Brenda, what's going on here? What have you done to this poor girl?" As Brenda sputtered and tried to defend herself, more guests began to speak up. They shared stories of how Brenda had spoken ill of me behind my back, painting me as lazy and incompetent. Joe, looking shell-shocked, finally found his voice. "Mom, is this true? Have you been lying to us all this time?" Brenda's facade crumbled. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally and finding none. In a last-ditch effort, she turned to me, her voice dripping with venom. "You ungrateful little witch. I welcomed you into this family, and this is how you repay me? By turning everyone against me?" The room collectively recoiled at her outburst. Joe stepped between us, his face a mask of disbelief and disappointment. "That's enough, Mom. I think you should leave." As Brenda was escorted out, her protests fading into the night, I stood there, trembling. The truth was finally out, but at what cost? Abigail squeezed my hand reassuringly. "You're not alone, Dr. Hartley. We're all here for you." I looked around the room, seeing sympathy and support in the faces of Brenda's former friends. Joe approached me, his eyes filled with remorse. "Lily, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Can we talk? Please." As the party disintegrated around us, I faced the biggest decision of my life. Could I forgive Joe for his blindness? Could we rebuild what Brenda had so systematically destroyed? Or was it too late to salvage the pieces of my shattered life? The aftermath of Brenda's party left our house in eerie silence. Joe and I sat at opposite ends of the couch, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between us. Abigail had insisted on staying, her presence a comforting buffer. "I think," Abigail began softly, "that we need to get the whole story out in the open. Joe, Lily's been through hell, and you need to hear it all." Joe nodded, his face ashen. "Please, Lily, I need to understand." Taking a deep breath, I started from the beginning. The words poured out of me like a flood. Brenda's manipulation, the constant criticism, the isolation. With each revelation, Joe's face crumpled further, disbelief giving way to horror. "I had no idea," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" Before I could answer, the front door burst open. Cliff, Joe's father, stormed in, his face thunderous. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded. "Brenda called me in hysterics, saying you've turned the whole town against her." Abigail stood, her small frame radiating strength. "Cliff, sit down. There's a lot you need to hear." For the next hour, Abigail and I laid out the entire sordid tale. Cliff's anger slowly morphed into shock, then shame. "I knew Brenda could be difficult," he mumbled, "but this is beyond anything I could have imagined." Just as we finished, the door opened again. Brenda swept in, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "Well, I hope you're all happy," she spat. "My reputation is in tatters, thanks to you ungrateful." "That's enough, Brenda," Cliff cut her off, his voice steely. "I've heard everything. How could you do this to our family? To Lily?" Brenda's face contorted with rage. "How could I? How could she? She stole my son, turned him against me. I was just trying to protect our family." "By destroying mine," I shot back, years of pent-up anger finally breaking free. "You made my life a living hell, Brenda. You took everything from me, my career, my confidence, nearly my marriage." Joe stood, placing himself between Brenda and me. "Mom, I think you should leave. Now." Brenda's eyes widened in disbelief. "Joey, you can't mean that, after everything I've done for you." "Everything you've done?" Joe's voice rose. "You've lied, manipulated, and abused the woman I love. Get out of our house, now." For a moment, Brenda looked like she might argue further. Then, with a final venomous glare at me, she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Cliff cleared his throat, looking years older than he had an hour ago. "Lily, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. If there's anything I can do." I held up a hand, suddenly exhausted. "Thank you, Cliff, but right now, I think I need some time." As Cliff and Abigail prepared to leave, Joe turned to me, his eyes pleading. "Lily, please, can we talk?" I looked at him, this man I'd loved enough to sacrifice everything for. Could I forgive him for being so blind? Could we rebuild what Brenda had so systematically destroyed? "I don't know, Joe," I said honestly. "I need time to think, to figure out who I am without Brenda's shadow looming over me." Joe nodded, tears in his eyes. "I understand. But please, don't give up on us. I love you, Lily. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." As I watched him walk away, I felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. The truth was finally out, Brenda's reign of terror over. But the cost had been high. Could I reclaim the pieces of my shattered life? And more importantly, did I want to? I turned to Abigail, who had become an unexpected ally in this storm. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She squeezed my hand reassuringly. "You heal, Dr. Hartley, and then you decide what kind of life you want to build from the ashes of the old one." As I stood there on the precipice of an uncertain future, I realized that for the first time in months I felt something I'd almost forgotten: hope. 6 months after Brenda's dramatic exit from our lives, I stood outside the hospital, my heart racing. Today marked my return to the ER, a day I'd both longed for and feared. "You've got this, Dr. Hartley," Abigail's voice came from beside me. Our unexpected friendship had become my anchor during the tumultuous months of healing and self-discovery. I took a deep breath and stepped through the doors, the familiar antiseptic smell washing over me. As I made my way to the locker room, I caught sight of my reflection. The woman staring back at me was different from the one who'd left this hospital over a year ago. Stronger, wiser, with a glint of hard-won confidence in her eyes. My first shift was a whirlwind of activity. As I treated patients, my hands moving with practiced skill, I felt a sense of rightness settle over me. This was where I belonged. During a rare quiet moment, I stepped out for some air. To my surprise, Joe was waiting by the entrance, a bouquet of flowers in his hand. "I wanted to be here for your first day back," he said, his voice tinged with hope and uncertainty. Over the past months, we'd been slowly rebuilding our relationship, attending couples therapy and having long, honest conversations. It hadn't been easy, but we were both committed to making it work. "Thank you," I said, accepting the flowers. "It means a lot that you're here." Just then, my pager went off. "I have to go," I said apologetically. Joe nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Go save lives, Dr. Hartley. I'll be here when you're done." As I rushed back inside, I felt a surge of gratitude for how far we'd come. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of emergencies and quick decisions. As I was preparing to leave, a commotion at the entrance caught my attention. My blood ran cold as I recognized the voice. Brenda. She was being wheeled in on a gurney, clearly in distress. Our eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. In that instant, I had a choice to make. I could walk away, let someone else handle her case. After all she'd put me through, no one would blame me. But as I looked at her, vulnerable and afraid, I remembered why I became a doctor in the first place. To help people, regardless of who they were or what they'd done. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward. "I'll take this one," I said to the surprised nurse. As I began examining Brenda, her eyes widened with recognition and, was that shame? "Lily," she whispered, "I don't deserve your help." I met her gaze steadily. "You're my patient, Brenda. That's all that matters right now." Over the next few hours, I worked tirelessly to stabilize Brenda's condition. It turned out to be a severe panic attack, brought on by the stress of her isolation and the weight of her actions. As she recovered, Brenda looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Lily, for everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I regret what I did to you." I nodded, feeling a weight I didn't know I was carrying lift from my shoulders. "Thank you for saying that, Brenda. It means a lot." As I left her room, I found Joe waiting outside. He pulled me into a tight embrace. "I saw what you did in there," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're incredible, Lily. I'm so proud of you." In that moment, surrounded by the bustle of the hospital, held in the arms of the man I loved, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led me here, back to myself, stronger and more resilient than ever. As we walked out of the hospital hand in hand, I realized that this wasn't just an ending, but a new beginning. I had reclaimed my career, my self-respect, and my voice, and I vowed never to let anyone silence me again. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities. There would be challenges, of course, but I was ready to face them head-on, because now I knew my own strength, and I had a support system that wouldn't let me fall. As the sun set on my first day back, I smiled, feeling truly at peace for the first time in years. The road ahead might be uncertain, but one thing was clear. Dr. Lily Hartley was back, and she was here to stay.